To get their thoughts on this issue and the aftershocks and confusion following Justin Trudeau's Senate shocker, we have our illustrious Thursday MP trio, Parliamentary Secretary Erin O'Toole for the Conservatives, NDP MP Craig Scott, and the leader of the only party to double her caucus over the holidays, Green Party leader of two, Elizabeth May. Welcome to you all. All right, day two of... It might be day, I guess it's day two of Fatino flub, if that's what you want to call it. But he is saying, look, these guys are being used as a front by the Public Service Alliance of Canada for ulterior motives. Erin, is there any proof of that? Why is the government's position now that this is just a union sneak attack?
Well, Don, I invite you and I invite other Canadians to look at this. I met some of those veterans when they were here in Ottawa in October. The House wasn't sitting, but they invited MPs, I was in Ottawa, to attend a PSAC media event. And at that event, I spoke to the veterans about the move to have the 600-plus network of Service Canada used for some of that in-person administrative work. And actually, we took information that Mr. Clark from Sydney gave to me at that event. And implemented those changes so that a caseworker from that Sydney office that's VAC trained will be in the Service Canada office as of next week. They know that the offices are not being utilized like they once were. I think veterans and Canadians also know we're opening up new operational stress injury clinics. We're trying to deal with mental health. There's a ton of new challenges that we've also got to address. So in terms of the PSAC thing, I'd let PSAC talk about their program. Most MPs following their media event in October have been bombarded by emails, and this was the second visit by many of the veterans. And look, whenever a veteran's upset and feels disrespected, as a veteran myself, that's a bad day for me and a bad day for Parliament. But the real issue here is about services for our veterans now and in the future.
Elizabeth May, what's your response to their response?
Well, it doesn't start with 2 days of Fatino flub. It's been years of callous disregard for veterans. The so-called Veterans Charter, which moved from a predictable, lifelong, monthly check to a disabled veteran to the lump sum payment. The closure of offices is not the first, it's not the first event. In what I find really shocking, because if there's anything that Stephen Harper has wanted to do as Prime Minister, it's been to, to sort of militarize our image, to talk about us as a warrior nation. The minimum thing you do for returning veterans is make sure they get consistent care, the services they need, and are respected. And it was very clear. This was sort of the pinnacle moment of disrespect towards veterans. And the idea that they're being used as shills for a union is just one more heap of abuse on men who had medals all over their shoulder, all over their chests were medals from their service to this country.
Craig, Erin makes the point. He says, look, we dealt with some of the veterans' concerns. We do have 600 points of contact. What's wrong with what they've done?
Well, the fact of the matter is the veterans themselves are pointing out the problems with the service that will be lost. And so the government doesn't seem to engage on what those service centres were still doing for the veterans who'd come to rely on them and what the Service Canada centres cannot provide. And we're having a debate right now in the House, a motion from one of my colleagues on how the Government of Canada has to be there for veterans.
Called to what, reopen the, or not, to stop the closure, basically, right?
Well, stop the closure, but also to deal with the rash of suicides and what is wrong with the mental health system with respect to veterans. The government may talk a lot about throwing money at the issue, but something has gone wrong, it appears, in how the system is working. We do know, at least from some behind-the-scenes information, that a lot of mental health workers who've been called, supposedly budgeted for, aren't being hired because there's some kind of a deficit reduction approach where to hire one, you have to get rid of somebody else in another unit. And that kinds of non-prioritization of the mental health of veterans is part of what they see and what we're talking about.
Do you think, Erin O'Toole, the veterans that are speaking out on this when we're in the meeting are representative of veterans, or do you get the sense that they're the squeaky wheels and they're getting all the grease from the media and they really don't deserve it?
Don, it's a great question. Veterans aren't a monolithic force. There's 650,000 veterans, 800,000 people, or 80,000 people in the forces now that soon will be veterans. Some are young, Afghan veterans in their 20s. Some are in their 80s and 90s. They deserve a variety of different needs and services. I don't like to talk money, but we have increased money every year we've been in office, but we're also trying to adapt new ways of serving. I spoke in the House on this afternoon. I'm actually disappointed by how little MPs know how veterans are served. The primary service provider is still our Legion, which had an act of Parliament in 1926. I spoke to veteran service officers in my riding, each of whom deal with hundreds of veterans in their home every day or every year. And I was mocked when I raised the Legion as an important part of our veteran solution. There are Legions, there are the standalone veterans offices. My area in Durham has never had a veterans office. Now they'll have 4 Service Canada offices if you want that personal administrative help. But those offices don't deliver services. It's important to recognize that.
Aside from the Veterans Charter, let's focus on this issue, though, Elizabeth May. The government has put a lot more money into it. Could you put enough money in to make the veterans happy, or is that a mission impossible?
No, I think it's very clear that there have been a series of decisions taken, and when the courts have found that we haven't done right by our veterans, the government then, the Conservative administration then goes to courts and appeals. This has been a long-standing series of things that have occurred that have shrunk what veterans were receiving compared to historically. And you don't have to believe me. Look at the Ombudsman's report. The Veterans Ombudsman in the last 2 have pointed out, the last report said we still have veterans who are living at levels of poverty that mean they're homeless. We're not doing enough. We're not doing it right. And you can ask if there would ever be enough money. I think the answer is yes. Veterans, people who serve this country, are very reasonable, dedicated, and in fact, small c conservative and sometimes large c conservative people. It takes a lot to make them this angry.
See, Craig, we all want something from the government. We all want better service from the government. Where do you draw the line? Where do you say veterans are not entitled to this much of a better service than others, or they're not entitled to... Where do you say you've got enough?
Well, from a point of principle, I think there are certain kinds of services and certain kinds of services to our society that warrant being treated as super priorities. And from my perspective, the whole question of absolute prioritization of the needs of veterans has to be a principle of governance. And so if many veterans are not seeing that through, as Elizabeth has been saying, sort of a build-up of all kinds of indicators, the government has to take that seriously. The fact that the government says, and I'm going to take them at their word, does support veterans, is in and of itself not enough.
I want to quickly switch to the Senate, even though we don't have a Liberal here. We've only got so many chairs, so the Liberals were bumped off this particular panel. But you're a big supporter of what Justin Trudeau did yesterday. How do you respond to the concerns of Western Canadians in particular, which you represent a riding out there, that there's only going to be 4 Liberals representing 4 Western provinces, so with no senators to sort of fill in the gaps from their electoral victories or defeats?
Well, look, I think the point of the Senate, and I think this is what Trudeau did, I'm not cheering a lot of Justin Trudeau's policies and positions, but on this one, I thought it was really innovative. I thought it was bold. It's very hard to reform the Senate since you have to open up the Constitution to do it. If we could wave a magic wand and move towards some solutions, elected Senate, abolition, great, but it's hard to do. And one of the things that came to light through the RCMP documents on the Nigel Wright, Mike Duffy investigation was the extent to which people in Harper's PMO think they should be able to control what senators do. The biggest atrocity that's happened in this Senate in at least 70 years was having PMO tell the Conservative senators to kill the climate bill that was passed in the Democratic House of Commons, Bruce Heyer's bill, and kill it before it ever went to committee. You can't have PMO running roughshod over senators, and breaking down that hyper-partisanship is something that Trudeau has now done, and the ball's in the Conservatives' court to see if they'll do the same thing.
We'll get to them in a second. Craig, quick last thoughts on you on this. I mean, other than saying Trudeau's a copycat and stole one of your ideas, what's the big problem with what he did?
Oh, that it's actually a fair bit of smoke and mirrors. Yes, indeed. I was up in the House for a full day's...
You and the Conservatives keep using the smokescreen allegation.
A full day of debate on my motion on October 22nd calling for departisanizing the Senate, where we emphasize it's not just the symbolic getting senators out of caucuses, but it's everything to do with the organizing, the fundraising, all the other roles that senators play. You'll notice that in the prepared remarks for Mr. Trudeau, this was not at all mentioned. It only came up in Q&A, and lo and behold, we're getting him saying, no, they won't be doing that kind of stuff, and senators sort of saying, we'll do what we want.
All right.
Well, that was your motion, Craig, was a long time before the audit that's coming very shortly on the Senate. I think that had more to do with this. I'll tell you, Don, we remember a few months ago Justin Trudeau said he admired the quick-moving decisiveness of China. We saw him exercise that yesterday, where he basically said off with the head of the entire Senate a few weeks before an audit that will say whether or not there were spending irregularities. At the end of the day, Don, our position, and the Supreme Court is deliberating this now, has always been that that body needs to be reformed primarily through election. Election gives legitimacy. We've all sought the trust of people of Canada, and we think that body should have the same. To move before that decision is out, and to make a suggestion that, no, we're not going to go for an election, I'm going to create another body to appoint an unelected body. To be honest, I think it's a ridiculous position, and we'll have to see if the audit shows that that's the reason he did it.
We'll see. That's coming up hopefully sooner rather than later. Thank you all.
I've released all my Green senators, too. I just thought I'd add that.
And the NDP's done the same.